spread to Washington itself. Congress refused to ratify many of the Western treaties on the grounds that they were too favorable to the Indians. And when settlers took the law into their own hands by massacring Indians and taking their land outright, there was little serious attempt to stop them. The native population of the West was devastated.
The estimates are that by the beginning of the 1800s, there were as many as 260,000 Indian people still living in what's now the state of California. 100 years later, by 1900, this 260,000 had been reduced to 15 to 20,000 at the very most. Most of this reduction could simply be attributed to the genocide that vigilante groups inflicted upon the Indian peoples of that area. And it's just case after case after case of villages of Indian people being surrounded and virtually wiped out overnight.
By the 1860s, the only major region still held by the Indians was the Great Plains. Here, tribes such as the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho had adopted the horse and the gun from the Europeans and developed a culture based on the hunting of bison. The wagon trains crossing the area on the way to California and Oregon disrupted the vast bison herds and made it increasingly difficult for the Indians to hunt. Driven close to starvation, the Plains tribes started to fight back against soldiers and settlers. For almost the first time, the United States found itself in a serious and prolonged Indian war. It was a conflict so bloody that it permanently fixed the image of the savage Indian on the American mind. The war for the Plains was marked by atrocities on both sides. Indians would mutilate the bodies of their victims to disable them in the next life. Scalps were sometimes taken for similar reasons. As stories of Indian killings spread, attitudes towards native people hardened. It was easy to forget that whites had been massacring and mutilating Indians and offering bounties for Indian scalps for generations. General Philip Sheridan expressed a widespread feeling of revulsion when he said, "The only good Indian I ever saw was dead." By now, many people made no distinction between different tribes or individuals. In the archetypal American myth of good versus evil, all Indians had become treacherous and bloodthirsty, deserving only to be destroyed. This atmosphere of hatred led to a number of unprovoked and indiscriminate attacks on Plains tribes. These intensified as the regular army became embroiled in the Civil War, and bands of militia volunteers were organized to pacify the frontier. According to a regular U.S. Army officer, T.I. McKinney, they were mostly Indian haters spoiling for a fight.
They do not know one Indian tribe from another and will kill anything in the shape of an Indian. I think if great caution is not exercised on our part, it will be a bloody war.
Late on the 28th of November 1864, a party of volunteers under a Methodist minister, Colonel John Chivington, set out from Fort Lyon in eastern Colorado to kill Indians. They were not particularly concerned about which Indians they killed. They headed for an encampment of Cheyennes and Arapahoes at Sand Creek. The camp's leader, Black Kettle, was a Cheyenne peace chief who had already concluded an armistice with the United States. Above his tepee, he flew the stars and stripes to avoid his people being confused with so-called hostile Indians. As Chivington and his men approached, Black Kettle reassured his people that they had nothing to fear. Robert Bent, the son of a white trader and a Cheyenne woman, had been forced into joining Chivington's party. He watched appalled as the drunken volunteers opened fire on his mother's people.
I saw the American flag waving and heard Black Kettle tell the Indians to stand around the flag. I also saw a white flag raised. These flags were in so conspicuous a position that they must have been seen. There seemed to be indiscriminate slaughter of men, women, and children. There were some 30 or 40 squaws collected in a hole for protection. They sent out a little girl, about 6 years old, with a white flag on a stick. She had not proceeded but by a few steps when she was shot and killed. All the squaws in that hole were afterwards killed. Everyone I saw dead was scalped. I saw a squaw cut open with an unborn child, as I thought, lying by her side.
Nearly 180 Indians, most of them women and children, were massacred at Sand Creek. Lieutenant James Connor described the scene when he rode through the camp the next day.
I did not see a body of a man, woman, or child, but was scalped. And in many instances, their bodies were mutilated in the most horrible manner. Men, women, and children's privates cut out. I heard one man say that he had cut out a woman's private parts and had them for exhibition on a stick. I even heard of numerous instances in which men had cut out the private parts of females and stretched them over the saddle bows and wore them over their hats while riding in the ranks.
As news of the Sand Creek massacre spread to the other tribes, the whole area erupted into war. The battle for the plains tied up thousands of men and cost the United States millions of dollars. It led to America's only defeat in a war against Indians when in 1868 the Oglala Sioux leader Red Cloud forced the government to conclude a peace treaty at Fort Laramie. The army had to withdraw from its forts, and the Sioux were left in possession of a huge tract of land stretching more than 300 miles from the Platte to beyond the Missouri River. This area contained most of the tribe's traditional hunting grounds, and at its heart was the Great Sioux Reservation, which included the sacred Black Hills. Having failed to defeat the Plains tribes militarily, the United States tried another, less expensive approach. White hunters were encouraged to embark on the wholesale destruction of the Indians' main food supply, the buffalo. As this new policy took effect, rotting buffalo carcasses littered the plains. They were stacked at railheads to be shipped to factories to make fertilizer and explosives. In the mid-1800s, there were estimated to be some 60 million buffalo in the United States. By 1910, there were thought to be just 85 single animals left. The whites thought they were simply destroying the Indians' food supply. In fact, they were destroying the whole center of the Plains Indians' complex culture.
I was born on the prairie where the wind blew free, and there was nothing to break the light of the sun. I love the land and the buffalo, and will not part with it. A long time ago, this land belonged to our fathers. But when I go up to the river, I see camps of soldiers on its banks. They kill my buffalo, and when I see that, my heart feels like bursting. I feel sorry. Has the white man become a child that he should recklessly kill and not eat? When the red men slay game, they do so that they may live and not starve.
All thought now of making new treaties with the tribes had gone, and when existing ones were broken, the government made little attempt to enforce the law. During the early 1870s, miners violated the Fort Laramie Treaty by prospecting for gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota, well within the Great Sioux Reservation. The government tried half-heartedly to remove them and then attempted to persuade the Sioux to sell the area. When the Sioux refused, the army was sent in to protect the prospectors working there illegally.
You got the 68 series of treaties, which really recognizes Indian tribes as autonomous small nations of being protected. By the time they take the Black Hills, 1877, Indians are childish, don't know what they're doing, can't use all the land, can't use the land the way the white men can, should be shunted aside, the kids should be taken away and educated, tribal mass broken up. The whole thing of the dark-skinned peoples being childish, primitive, savage, incapable of education, capable of being raised to the level of poor whites, maybe, the criminal class whites. But that's about it.
In 1876, the government, fearing war over the Black Hills, sent in the army to round up the Sioux by force. The expedition ended with the annihilation of General Custer and his men at the Little Bighorn. The country was shocked. A humiliated government poured reinforcements into the plains. Gradually, heavily outnumbered and often starving, the bands of Sioux and Cheyenne were brought into reservation compounds where they were incarcerated. The Plains tribes were now finally facing the disaster that had already overwhelmed the rest of America's native people.
The white man made us many promises, more than I can remember. But they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it.
Less than 400 years after the first white contact, the Indians had lost virtually the whole of North America. Slowly but relentlessly, Europeans had reduced their land base in what is now the United States from around 2,000 million acres to less than 140 million. And with the impact of disease, warfare, starvation and despair, the Indians themselves had been driven close to extinction. Throughout America, the remnants of defeated tribes were trying to adapt to reservation life. Impoverished, disease-ridden and demoralized, they were subjected to a military regime designed to break their spirit. In 1888, a Nevada Paiute called Wovoka had a vision. God told him that by dancing and performing certain rituals, Indians could bring back their old way of life. Wovoka and his followers believed that their dancing would make the ground roll up like a carpet, taking the whites with it, and that the dead Indians and their animals would return. In a last frenzied effort to preserve their way of life, tribespeople throughout the West danced and sang for supernatural help. The help they danced and sang for never came. In December 1890, nervous U.S. soldiers opened fire on a group of unarmed Sioux ghost dancers at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. More than 300 men, women and children were killed.
I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the Crooked Gulch, as plain as when I saw them with eyes still young. And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream. The nation's hoop is broken and scattered. There is no center any longer. And the sacred tree is dead.
To the majority of Americans, the Wounded Knee Massacre was the last engagement of the Indian Wars, and it was the moment when Indians were finally consigned to the pages of history. The savage, part brute, part helpless child who had haunted the frontier since the arrival of the first settlers was at last defeated. But the image of the savage, with all its contradictions, was to live on. The brute, who was also a child, had to be prepared for life in modern America. And that meant unleashing on Indians an ordeal in some ways even more terrible than the physical destruction that had gone before.
The US government's trying to force the American Indians into a European way of life tomorrow night at 6. While next this evening, exclusively for UK Horizons, tomorrow's World Plus.